Everyone at the funeral of Albert Dumas wore shades of gray and black, the way tradition dictated. A sea of polished shoes and solemn expressions moved like clockwork under the vaulted ceiling of St. Clair's Chapel. The air carried the scent of incense, lilies, and secrets no one wanted to name. Then came the man in navy blue. He didn't walk like someone who had wandered in by mistake. He carried himself with quiet certainty, stepping through the aisle not to be seen but to see. In his hands was a photograph, an old print. Two men, arms around each other, smiling at the beach. One of them was Albert. He paused at the casket. No one breathed. He placed the photo gently on the polished wood, then whispered, "Thank you for loving me until the end. I kept my promise. I hope you did too." The silence shattered. Sylvie, Albert's wife of 3 decades, stood frozen in place. Thierry and Juliette, their adult children, exchanged confused, outraged looks. Only Mathis, the youngest son, barely in his 20s, sat quietly. His gaze didn't move from the man now stepping back into the crowd. Later, at the family estate, the reading of the will was set to begin. Maître Laville, the longtime family lawyer, had everything ready. Everyone had questions, but one hovered above them all: who was that man? And why had he called Albert his husband? Laville cleared his throat. He opened the folder. Per the last will and testament of Mr. Albert Dumas, dated the 17th of November last year, he began, "The estate, including properties in Paris and Marseille, is to be divided as follows." He listed names: Sylvie, Thierry, Juliette, Mathis, but not the man from the chapel. No mention, no recognition, nothing. When Laville closed the folder and asked for signatures, the man in blue stepped forward. "I believe," he said calmly, "you may have skipped a page." Gasps rippled across the room. He placed a second document on the table. The same date, the same letterhead, but a different ending. "To my husband, Gabriel Fournier," it read. "I leave the contents of my personal safe, all unpublished manuscripts, and the rights to the Dumas Foundation for Equality." Sylvie stood up. "This is forgery. My husband would never," but Mathis finally spoke. "I've met him before, years ago, in the cabin by the lake." The room froze again. Gabriel didn't flinch. The truth had been spoken, but it was only the beginning. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or if you've lived a truth no one wanted to hear, this story is for you. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more real, powerful narratives that speak to who we really are, not just who we're expected to be. The office of Maître Laville was dressed in polished oak, leather chairs, and the illusion of order. Outside, the rain tapped a steady rhythm against the high windows, like a metronome marking the tension rising inside. Gabriel stood silent by the mantelpiece, watching the flames in the hearth crackle beneath the family crest. The document he had just placed on the table remained untouched. No one dared move first. Sylvie sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Thierry leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like a prosecutor before cross-examination. Juliette hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her posture dripped disbelief. Mathis stood behind them all, his expression unreadable. Maître Laville adjusted his glasses and looked down again at the second will. It was genuine. The signatures matched. The notary seal was valid. The date was identical, and the final line was unmistakable. "To my husband, Gabriel Fournier." He hesitated, then spoke in a brittle voice. "It appears, though I may have overlooked this version." Gabriel didn't blink. "You didn't overlook it. You buried it." Laville's lips parted, but no words came. Mathis stepped forward. "I remember him," he said quietly. "He stayed with us once, years ago. I was 12. It was the winter father disappeared for 3 days and said he was riding by the lake. I went to the cabin to bring him his coat. He wasn't alone." Juliette turned to him sharply. "You never told us that. I didn't understand it then." Mathis replied, "But I do now. Sylvie's voice cut through the room like glass. This is an insult. My husband would never marry a man behind my back. But Gabriel turned slowly toward her. His voice was low but unwavering. He didn't marry me behind your back. He married me after your separation 7 years ago. He told me he had moved on. I believed him. Thierry scoffed. And yet, here you are, digging through ashes, holding up a scrap of paper, demanding to be called family. Gabriel reached into his briefcase and produced a small folder. I'm not here to demand anything, he said, but I will not allow Albert's last wishes to be erased. He slid the folder toward Laville. Inside were documents from Belgium where same-sex marriage had been legal for over a decade, complete with marriage certificates, photos from the ceremony, even a notarized joint account statement from a bank in Antwerp. The tension in the room fractured, not with an explosion, but with the weight of undeniable evidence. Laville opened the folder slowly, scanning the contents. His face turned pale. This is lawful, he murmured. Gabriel nodded, and it was kept in Albert's safe. He gave me the key. He told me, if they pretend you don't exist, show them what I left behind. Juliet leaned forward, her voice cold. How do we know this wasn't staged? You could have manipulated him. He was vulnerable. He wasn't vulnerable. Gabriel replied, he was tired of hiding. The fire crackled again in the silence. Gabriel's eyes never wavered. Albert was not ashamed of who he was. He was ashamed of how little space the world left him to be that man. Laville folded his hands, lips drawn tight. Legally, he said slowly, this version of the will supersedes the first. As of now, Gabriel Fournier is entitled to all items listed in the final clause, including intellectual property, the private estate in Evian, and the full administrative rights to the Dumas Foundation. Sylvie's chair screeched against the floor as she stood. This will be contested. Of course, Gabriel said. That's why Albert made a video. Gasps again. He didn't elaborate. Not yet. He just looked at them, at the room that had once called itself a family, and waited for the cracks to widen. The video was stored on a small USB drive, the kind sold in gas stations, easily overlooked. Its plastic was scratched, its label peeling, but inside it lived a voice the room hadn't heard in over 2 weeks, Albert's. Gabriel placed the drive gently on Maitre Laville's desk, beside the thick documents and official seals. I was told this would not be necessary, he said, but after today, I realize Albert knew his family better than I did. He didn't look at Sylvie or Thierry or Juliet. He looked only at Mathis, and Mathis gave the smallest nod, as if to say, yes, it's time. Laville hesitated, then inserted the drive into his laptop. The screen blinked to life, the room dimmed, and Albert appeared. He sat in a simple chair, in what looked like the cabin by the lake, same stone wall, same dim light from the window. He wore a thick sweater, glasses in his hand. He looked tired, but not frail, not defeated, just finished with silence. If you're watching this, he began, it means the truth was hidden again. His voice filled the room. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. I made mistakes, not in loving Gabriel, not in building a second life, but in thinking that my first one, my marriage, my children could exist alongside it without friction. He paused. You, Sylvie, you once told me you'd rather be publicly humiliated than privately deceived. I believed you. That's why I told you the truth, and why we separated with dignity, or so I thought. Sylvie's hands trembled in her lap, but she said nothing. Albert continued, to Thierry and Juliet, I know what I am to you. A father, a provider, a symbol, and I accept that. But I am more than those things. I am a man who loved a man. I did not die ashamed of that. I only regret that I wasn't brave enough to let you see it while I was alive. Juliet turned her face away. Thierry's jaw clenched. Albert held up a document, his will. This version, he said, is the one I signed with both a notary and my conscience. If you're looking for my signature elsewhere, It may be there, but not with my heart. He looked off camera, then back again. To Gabriel. I don't know if they'll ever see you the way I did. I don't know if Mathis will remember the winter we shared soup by the fireplace, or if Juliet will forgive what she never understood. His voice softened. But I hope one day someone will tell this story not to shame them, but to show that even in a house full of portraits and bloodlines, the heart chooses its own air. The screen went dark. No one spoke. The absence of Albert was more alive now than any moment since his death. In less than 5 minutes, he had unbuilt decades of certainty. He had told his truth, not with force, but with choice. Maitre Laville leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Gabriel stood still, and Mathis whispered into the quiet. He didn't want to be erased. Juliet finally turned to him. He lied to us. No, Mathis said. He waited. There's a difference. Thierry rose from his chair, walked to the window, and stared out into the rain. If he loved you so much, he said to Gabriel, why didn't he bring you into our lives? Gabriel didn't flinch. Because he was afraid. And maybe he thought I was strong enough to forgive him for that. Laville cleared his throat. This video, if uncontested, will stand as testimony to the legitimacy of the will, legally and ethically. Sylvie stood up. You think a recording will make me believe this wasn't a betrayal? Gabriel's answer was steady. No, I think it will make you realize it wasn't yours to control. The fire began to crackle again. Not violently, just enough to remind them all that some truths burn slowly and forever. It was Mathis who broke the silence this time. Not by speaking, but by moving. He crossed the room and stood beside Gabriel, not in defiance of his family, not in allegiance to a stranger, but in quiet alignment with a memory that had waited 10 years to surface. I remember the soup, he said. Juliet blinked. What Mathis turned toward her. I remember it was snowing, and I got lost walking back from the lake. I knocked on the door of the cabin, and Gabriel opened it. He didn't panic. He just smiled, gave me a blanket, and made soup. I was cold and tired, and I didn't know who he was, but I felt safe. He looked toward Gabriel. You told me your name, but you also told me not to mention the visit to anyone. I was 12. I thought it was just a kind man helping me. Thierry stepped forward, voice taut. So that's your proof? A bowl of soup and a child's memory. Mathis didn't flinch. No, the proof is that Dad trusted him with a part of himself we never got to know. Sylvie walked slowly to the center of the room. You're young, you don't understand how a man can confuse guilt with affection. But it was Gabriel who responded. I've lived long enough to know the difference. He turned towards Sylvie, not with anger but clarity. Albert loved you. That's undeniable. You raised a family together. You built a life. But somewhere along the way, he stopped being allowed to be his whole self. And that part he gave to me not because you failed him, but because the world gave him only 2 choices: survive or be honest. Juliet's voice cracked. You had him for 7 years. We had him for 30. Who are you to claim him? I never claimed him. Gabriel replied. He gave himself freely, in pieces, because he thought that was the only way. The room filled with a new silence, not the kind born of shock or defense, but of quiet reckoning. Juliet walked to the hearth, took the framed photo from above it, Albert in a business suit, standing between his children. She stared at it for a long moment. He wore that same suit the day I got into college, she said softly. But he didn't smile like he did in your photo. She handed the frame to Mathis. Mathis studied it. He smiled like that when he was writing. He said, when no one was watching. Thierry crossed his arms. This doesn't change anything. Love doesn't get to rewrite what we knew. Maybe not, Mathis said, but it might explain what we never understood. Juliet turned toward Gabriel again. I still don't know if I believe you, or him, or even this whole version of our father. But I do know one thing. She looked at Mathis. We were not the only ones who lost him. Gabriel said nothing. He didn't need to. For the first time since the funeral, someone in that room had said "we" and meant it. Behind them, the screen still sat black, but the echo of Albert's words remained. The heart chooses its own air. Weeks passed, lawyers moved slowly, as they always did, but the documents spoke clearly. The marriage between Albert and Gabriel was legal. The second version of the will held precedent, the rights to the Dumas Foundation, Albert's private writings, and the estate in Evian now belonged to Gabriel Fournier, not by claim, but by law. And more than that, by love. Gabriel didn't contest the other inheritances. He made no demands for more than what was written. Instead, he began visiting the Evian estate quietly, alone. He returned to the cabin by the lake where Albert had once recorded his final truth, and there he began again. He opened a small office in the back of the house. On the front gate, a simple sign now hung: the Dignity Fund, for lives lived honestly. He dedicated the foundation to serving older LGBTQ+ individuals who had spent decades in hiding. People who, like Albert, had lived double lives not because they were ashamed, but because the world demanded it of them. People who had names no longer spoken, photographs hidden in drawers, stories erased, and slowly the foundation began to grow. Word traveled. Donations came. Former friends of Albert, men and women who had known pieces of him, reached out, some with tears, some with silence, most with deep respect. One morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain. Inside it, a single sheet, written in tight, familiar cursive, was the message: "You honored him, even when we couldn't. For what it's worth, thank you. J." Gabriel didn't need to guess who had signed it. The initials were enough. Later that day, Mathis arrived by train. He carried with him a box of Albert's old notebooks, packed neatly, saved from being discarded. Together, they read through the words Albert had never published. Some were essays, some were love letters. Most were stories fragmented and aching, full of moments that had never found their place. And Gabriel, with quiet patience, began to compile them into a book. He titled it "Half the Truth," with a subtitle added later by Mathis and everything he meant to say. They launched it at a small gathering held by the lake. Only a dozen guests came, but among them was Juliet. She didn't speak much. But when Gabriel handed her the first printed copy, she whispered, "I think he would have liked the cover." Gabriel smiled. "I think he would have liked being known." The sun was setting as the last guest left. Gabriel remained by the water's edge, holding the final letter Albert had ever written to him, one never shown to the family. It read, "My life wasn't perfect, but you gave me a place where I didn't have to explain myself. That's all I ever wanted, to be a whole person in someone else's eyes. If they never see me, make sure they see you. You're the part of me I never regretted." Albert Gabriel folded the letter, tucked it into his jacket, and looked up. The water was still. The mountains in the distance glowed orange with the final light of day. And for the first time since the funeral, peace arrived, not in the form of justice, but in the quiet breath of being seen, remembered, and loved without conditions. Have you ever hidden part of yourself just to keep a family together? Or been forced to grieve someone who was never publicly yours? Tell us in the comments, because your truth matters. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more powerful stories that bring hidden lives to light, because every kind of love deserves to be remembered.